Welcome to a new lesson as well as a new course. This is Greek Grammar 2, second semester Greek Grammar. You should have had Greek Grammar Semester 1 as a prerequisite for this class. And so I want to welcome you back if you did finish Greek Grammar number 1. If you were with us for the last semester, you know that the textbook that we were using was by Ray Summers entitled Essentials of New Testament Greek. Be sure to have the revised edition. There is a much older edition that is from, I believe, pre-1990 or so. So you want to have the one that says revised. And also there's a corresponding workbook that goes with that textbook. The workbook is entitled the same, Essentials of New Testament Greek, but it's subtitled A Student's Guide, and that is by Stephen Cox. The textbook is by Ray Summers. Now in this semester, what we're going to do is look at further forms of the Greek verb, especially. It'll be very intensive in terms of verbs and verbals. And by verbals, I mean participles and infinitives. But we're also going to look at further forms of the Greek verb. The aorist, as we'll see in this lesson, the first aorist form, the second aorist form in the next lesson. And then we're going to look at the perfect form and the pluperfect form. We'll also look not only at indicatives, but also subjunctives, imperatives, and optative, and all of that. And also we're going to be looking at further forms of pronouns, as well as adjectives, and also the article. And so we have a lot on tap for this semester. But for this particular lesson, we want to focus on just the first aorist form of verbs in the active and middle voice, and then only in the indicative mood. And aorist forms of verbs are very important in the sense that they are the most frequent form of a verb that you're going to find in the New Testament. This is unlike English in the sense that in English, the present tense is the form that's used most frequently. That is not the case in Greek. It's close, but the aorist is used more frequently. Now for this particular lesson, dealing with first aorist forms of verbs and Ray Summers, chapter 15 in your textbook, what we want to do first of all is look at the morphology of aorist tense verbs. How are they formed? What are the constituent parts of a particular word as it appears in the aorist tense form? So it's a little bit of a technical, nitty-gritty type of stuff. Just to understand what we're looking at by a word that is in the aorist tense form. And then secondly, what we want to do after that is just look at some of the vocabulary for this particular chapter or lesson and corresponding to Ray Summers' textbook, chapter 15. And then for the second part of this lesson today, what we want to look at is the meaning of the aorist tense and its various uses in different contexts and its variety of uses, as it's quite flexible, just like the present tense. And we'll see the significance of the aorist and how to interpret it and some guidelines on how not to interpret it. And just as with previous lessons, we're going to do the same for these lessons in semester 2. We'll start with this alpha slide to show you that we're at the beginning of the lesson, and then when you see the omega at the end, you'll know we've reached the end of our lesson. So let's begin with a little bit of review. Now, what we have already covered in previous lessons in Greek 1 are the various verb forms that you see in the far left column for the present tense. If I could just circle it here with a pen. The present tense, future, and imperfect. And we've looked at all three voices so far for those forms, and only in the indicative mood and first, second, and third person in singular and plural. We haven't gotten to the imperative, subjunctive, and optative moods yet, but what we're going to do in this lesson is look at the aorist form now, so we'll be adding that. And just the first aorist form and the active and middle voice for this particular lesson. We'll get to the passive voice and the second aorist forms in a future lesson. Now I mentioned that there are two types of aorist tense verbs in terms of their form. They are formed two different ways. The first aorist and second aorist are distinct, and they're basically two broad categories or types of aorist. However, you should understand that though they are formed differently and they look differently in terms of their spelling, they function exactly the same way in New Testament usage. So they're only different when it comes to morphology or spelling. Now, most verbs like the present tense lexical form luo that you've already learned only occur in one of these two aorist forms. So luo, for example, will always be a first aorist tense form when it occurs in its aorist form. It won't be in both the first aorist spelling and the second aorist spelling. It only will be one or the other. And in this case with luo, our common verb that we've been using throughout as sort of our, to form our paradigms with, luo only occurs in the first aorist tense form. There are some verbs I should mention that can occur with both aorist forms. It's a little confusing when you see those particular verbs. They can be spelled one of two ways, and again, they have the same meaning. And since they appear in either first aorist form or second aorist form, it's a little confusing for students, but I'll clarify that point a little more when we get to the subject of principal parts and the list of principal parts that you can find in your textbook on pages 185 to 190, which is very helpful. Now, when it comes to verb formation for the first aorist, let's look at some of the details here now as far as how these aorist tense forms are put together. This is the first aorist active voice indicative mood form, and I have up on the PowerPoint slide here for you the first person plural form of luo, not the first person singular form, but the first person plural form. And I put that up instead of the first person singular because it's a little easier to see the constituent parts of this word when we look at the plural in this case, elusamen, and which means we loosed, by the way. So we would understand that as basically a past indicative, we loosed instead of I loosed. And what you'll see here is there is an augment first of all. Again, if I could use my pen and just circle with red, the epsilon here is our augment, indicating that there's a time element involved, that this is going to be generally considered past time in the indicative mood. And that's not always true, as we'll see, that this particular form is capable of being used for present and future tense, time anyway. But normally there's an augment with these aorist tense verbs, and there will be with the first aorist form. And so we'll talk a little bit more about augments in just a minute. But then we see our root here, the the stem, which was also the stem in the present tense root word luo, our lexical form for present active indicative first person singular. You'll see that it uses the same stem. But now with aorist tense verbs, what you often see is a tense sign, it's called, and it's the letter sigma, which when you see that embedded in a word, that's sort of a clue to you to look for that now you're looking at an aorist tense verb as opposed to a present tense or imperfect tense. Now you have to be careful with that because the future tense sign also is a sigma in many cases, so be careful. The future tense, however, doesn't have the augment at the beginning, so that's another clue. Now here's the other thing to note. You will find that with the first aorist form, there is a connecting vowel, and in this case it's going to be most often alpha instead of the omicron or the epsilon, which we saw for the present and imperfect tense forms of verbs. And then you've got your ending, which is first person plural ending. And so really there's like 5 parts to just this one simple word that says in essence, we loosed. Now you'll see here in this slide that I've highlighted the epsilon in yellow there for elus amen, we loosed, and this indicates that it's the augment at the beginning of the word. You see the present tense first person plural form luamen there as well highlighted in yellow. But to form the first aorist first person plural form for the active indicative, what you're going to do is put an augment on that word, and that's the letter there, epsilon. And there are two types of augments, a syllabic augment and a temporal augment. You should remember the syllabic augment from our study in imperfect tense forms, as the imperfect tense also took an augment. And here the syllabic augment is added, and it's appropriately labeled since it's adding a whole new syllable to the word. It's just prefixed to the stem of the verb there, lu. And here's the second type of augment for the aorist verb. It involves the lengthening of a pre-existing vowel that's already part of a verb. For example, in the present tense, the word for I hear is akuo, or I prepare, hetoimadzo, and you can see that each of those words already has a vowel prefixed to the word. And so in this case, you wouldn't add another vowel as an augment. That would be syllabic augment. But what you would do is take the pre-existing vowel and it just gets lengthened. And again, that's what we call a temporal augment because it's lengthening the sound. It's really more of a sound issue than it is indicating anything about time. So I'm not sure why it's necessarily called a temporal augment, but that is its proper term. And so we've looked at the formation of a particular form of the first aorist verb, but now let's look at a paradigm with all of the forms for the first aorist active indicative of luo. This is the active voice paradigm now that we're looking at here. And there's a gloss for each form of the aorist verb that assumes that the context indicates a completed action in past time, and that will be true most of the time. So for example, when you see next to elusa, the first person singular form there, I put the gloss up there for you, meaning I loosed. Well, normally it means I loosed, referring to a past event, but context is going to determine that. So just for memory's sake and ease of use, you have these translations, in essence, of a singular word, elusa, but elusa has no context to it. So we can't say for certain that it's past tense, but for all practical purposes, let's just assume that for our memorization's sake and our study going forward. And I'll clarify a little bit more about contextual factors as we go along. But first of all, you can see the parts to the verb luo, I loose, when it's put in the first aorist active indicative form and the first person singular, it will be elusa. You see the augment epsilon, you see the stem lu, you see the tense sign sigma, and you see the connecting vowel, the alpha there. And the ending, there's a contraction with the connecting vowel and the ending, so you're just left with alpha in the case of the first person singular. Going down to the second person singular, elusas, you loosed. And then third person singular would mean he, she, or it loosed, elusen. And in this case, notice there's a nu on the end of that word. Technically, the word ends in the epsilon right before the nu, but you have a movable nu, which is very common with that third person singular form of verbs. And moving now to the plural, we see plural first person, we loosed, is elusamen, and it looks very similar to the form that we studied for the present active indicative, lu amen, except it's elusamen. And the same is true with the second person plural form, elusate, meaning you plural loosed. Very similar to the second person plural form for the present active indicative of luete. Going down to the third person plural form, they loosed, it's elusan. And you'll notice it's very similar in spelling to the first person singular, elusa, except there's a nu on the end, as well as very similar to the third person singular, elusen. Instead of the epsilon nu ending, it's alpha nu ending for that third person plural. So those are the forms for the first aorist active indicative of luo. Now here's the paradigm for the first aorist middle voice indicative mood form for luo. And you'll notice that I've put a gloss up there as well. And now with the middle voice, remember that it is the voice of self-interest. That's the basic idea. It's not necessarily reflexive, though it often is. And it could also be translated here in these glosses. I loosed for myself, or you loosed for yourself, or he loosed for himself, that sort of thing. But here I've provided the reflexive concept for you, just again to make it simple to memorize a translation to go with each of these spellings for the aorist middle indicative of luo. And first person singular, we have elus amein. Second person singular, eluso. Third person singular, elusata. First person plural, elus amatha. And second person plural, elusesta. And third person plural, elusanta. And if you compare these to the present tense indicative forms again, you'll find that they're very similar, as well as with the imperfect tense. So there's some commonalities to how these verbs are formed, and also some key differences to let you know that now you're looking at an aorist. You'll notice the prevalence of the alpha connecting vowel that you don't see with the imperfect tense form or the present tense form. They more often use omicron or epsilon. And so that's another clue here that you're looking at an aorist tense form. I should also just point out that there are two infinitive forms that you should know at this point to go along with the aorist verb forms. Technically, an infinitive is not a verb, it's a verbal part of speech. Verbs are finite, whereas infinitives and participles are not. They're verbals. In fact, an infinitive is not a finite verb. So think of it that way. But infinitives don't have person or number, and so there's just two forms with the first, second, or third person subjects. Whether it's singular or plural, you're just going to have two forms instead of the six that you're used to memorizing. And so here you have the active voice form, lusai, meaning to loose. That's how you would translate that. Or the middle voice form, to loose oneself, lusasthai is the word that's used there. There is a separate form for the passive infinitive, luthanai, which we'll see in our next lesson, but we're going to skip that one for now. And there's also separate forms for second aorist infinitives, which are different from what you see on your screen right now. That's also the subject for a future study. Now, I should mention at this point, since we're talking about infinitives, that in your textbook on page 71 by Ray Summers, you'll find this statement. The first aorist infinitive has no augment because it does not indicate past time, as does the aorist indicative. Now, at this point, you might be saying, well, Tom, I thought you were teaching us that the aorist tense can be used for all three tenses of time, can be used for an event or action that occurs in the past, or in the present, or in the future. And that is true. But most often, it occurs in past time. As you look at its usage in context, and you look at all the aorist tense forms that occur in the New Testament, you'll find more often than not, they occur in context of past time. And the same is true with the present tense. Most often that occurs in present time. And I just want to mention that there is debate as to whether time is inherently part of indicative mood verbs at all. Does time have any relation to the indicative mood verb? And there are those Greek scholars who say yes. men like Buste Fanning and Daniel Wallace from Dallas Seminary. And others say no, men like Stanley Porter and Constantine Campbell, also outstanding Greek scholars in their own right. And so I want you to understand there's some debate about that question at this point. But it is interesting to note that the imperfect and aorist tense forms are used most often for past tense events when you look at their context. And for those two, the imperfect and aorist tense forms, both of them have augments, whereas the present tense doesn't. For example, look at the yellow highlighted words that I put up on this particular slide. The first one is the present infinitive form, luein, meaning to loose, followed by the aorist infinitive, lousai. Now, neither infinitive form has an augment, but when you come to the aorist indicative, elousa, I loosed, you'll see that it does have the epsilon augment there. Now, why is the augment added for the indicative, but it's not part of the aorist infinitive? That's because infinitives don't necessarily have a relation to time. They can be used for any time at all. But frankly, so can an aorist indicative in a particular context. But most often, you will see normally that aorist indicative is used in context dealing with past time. Now, continuing with the quote from page 71 of your textbook, Ray Summers goes on to say, the primary difference between the present infinitive and the aorist infinitive is the kind of action. Now, I trust you can understand at this point in your studies, as we've looked at aspect versus action sart versus time, that statement in your textbook is technically not accurate. The aorist tense form does not indicate kind of action, but it indicates aspect. And I'll expand on that in just a moment. But aspect is indicated whether we're dealing with a verb or a participle or an infinitive. Aspect is always the inherent feature of those parts of speech. Whereas kind of action, what we would call action sart, is always determined by context or by the nature of the particular verb itself, something that we call lexis. We will come back to this subject of aspect in a moment in this lesson, but first I want to move on to the subject of principal parts of verbs, and then vocabulary, and then we'll come back to the distinction between aspect, action sart, and time. What is the principal parts of verbs? Well, we introduced this a few lessons ago when we were looking at future forms, future active forms of verbs. You became acquainted with this principal parts of verbs list. You will find this at the back of your textbook on pages 185 to 190. It's very helpful to have. I would encourage you to use it and become familiar with it. What it is it helps you identify a form that you may not be quite as familiar with. For example, usually students memorize the present active indicative first person singular lexical form of a verb. In this case, in the upper left corner under present active, you'll see agapao. Agapao means I love, and it's in the present active indicative form there, first person singular. By the way, these are all in the first person singular. We don't get the second person singular, third person. It's not conjugated. You don't see a whole paradigm up here, because those who put these charts together, they understand that if you've got the first person singular, you can figure out the other persons and singular and plural forms. So let's take agapao up there in the upper left corner. I love. Let's say that you don't recall what the aorist active indicative spelling should be for first person singular. So you go to your principal parts chart and you go over 3 columns and you find the aorist active form there. Agapesa, agapesa. So you would see that that's how you would spell the aorist form of it, or the perfect, or the other columns that you see that it will get to in the future. So that's the value of having a principal parts chart list for you. You can find out the spellings at a glance. A couple things I should point out here are that there's no imperfect tense column. And why is that? You see future, aorist, perfect, present, but there's no imperfect tense column. Well, that's because the imperfect tense is formed based on the present tense. So if you know the present tense, which you have on the far left there, you can figure out the imperfect tense. It uses the same stem, and so you just change the augment for the imperfect tense, add that, and then you add the endings, and voila, you've got the imperfect tense. So if you know the present, you can figure out the imperfect. Something else to note here on this chart, and that is that there's only the first 4 words in the on the first page of the principal parts list. Now, obviously, on page 185, you've got a lot more than agapao, hagidzo, hagiadzo, hagnidzo, ago. But let's look at that bottom verb, ago, meaning I lead. Its future active form is oxo, and then the third column over, you see aorist active forms, and there's 2 of them there. Now, why are there 2? For aorist active of ago, unlike the other ones that you see up there? Well, the reason that there's 2 possible spellings under aorist active is because there are actually 2 aorist forms, a first aorist and a second aorist. The exa spelling would reflect the first aorist, which we're learning about in this lesson, and then the agagon spelling would reflect the second aorist form that we're going to learn about in a future lesson. So sometimes on the principal parts list, you will see 2 spellings under the same category, and that just tells you that there's 2 possible spellings for, let's say, the aorist here, but not necessarily for the future form, or the present form, or the aorist passive form of ago. Now, you may also be asking, well, why are there blank spots in some of these columns here and rows? Well, that's because that particular form never occurs in the New Testament, and so it's left off the chart. The only ones that appear are those that actually occur in the New Testament. Now let's move on to our vocabulary list for chapter 15 for this lesson, taken from your textbook. And you'll notice that with each of these new vocabulary words, they're really not entirely new. You've had them before in previous chapters and lessons, but what we do find is that every one of these vocabulary words is just simply the first aorist spelling of a word you already know from the present tense. And so, for example, at the very top of the list there, akuo, you know that that means I hear. The present active indicative first person singular form, akuo. And then the first aorist active first person singular form of that same word would be ekusa. And you see that the eta there that prefixes ekusa is just simply the augment, and the alpha for the present tense has been elongated with temporal augment into the longer form of eta. You also see the sigma right there in the word ekusa, and so the sigma is your tense sign that this is it's not future tense, it's an aorist tense. And one clue to that as well is not only the augment at the beginning of the word, but also the alpha ending. Alpha is more characteristic of the aorist tense verbs as opposed to epsilon and omicron, which you saw with the present tense and even imperfect tense. Going down to the second word in the list, the word is apostello, which means I send. And you'll notice that when it comes to the first aorist spelling of that same word, apestela, that we've got some serious change going on here. You'll notice that the omicron has changed to an epsilon, and you'll notice that the stem has changed from a singular epsilon to an epsilon iota diphthong. And instead of 2 lambdas, 1 lambda has dropped out. And of course, the ending changes from omega to alpha. So some serious change there. And I won't go into detail as to why that occurs, but let me just mention that this is a word that contains a liquid consonant, it's called, the lambda. When you have a word whose stem ends in a liquid consonant, which we learned about in chapter 1, we're also going to revisit this in chapters 18 and 26 in our textbook. But when you've got a word whose stem ends in a liquid consonant, funny things happen. A liquid consonant is just one of the 4 letters that are very fluid, that sort of roll off the tongue easily. Lambda, mu, nu, rho. Those are liquid consonants. And so that's why there's been a contraction that's occurred. I won't get into the morphology of that, but I just want to point out that sometimes that happens. Next on the list we see is archemi, and this is a deponent verb in its present active indicative form. Remember what deponent verbs are? They are active in function, but in form they have the middle and passive voice endings. So instead of archo, which would be the normal present active indicative form, it would be archemi, which is the first person singular ending for the middle and passive of the present tense. But notice when it comes over to the first aorist spelling, erxamein, you see that it's changed obviously with the augment. There's been an elongation from the alpha to the eta prefix. And then of course you have the alpha amein instead of amai. And what's interesting to note about the first aorist form, erxamein, is that it also is deponent. This is the middle voice form, but it's functioning as an active voice verb. And so just like archemi was active in function, but middle and passive in form, when it comes to the aorist spelling of this same word, guess what? With the first aorist, you're going to have the same issue. It's a deponent in the aorist as well, which means it's a middle spelling, but it's active in function. I know that's confusing, but there are these verbs that have been labeled deponent verbs, and you just got to watch out for those. Now, when it comes to archemi here, I should make a note here for you as well, and just be aware of this. Don't assume that just because a verb is deponent in one tense, like present tense, that it will necessarily also be a deponent verb in all the other tenses in which it occurs. That isn't always the case, though it is here with archemi. For example, as you look at your principal parts list in your textbook, you'll see a very common verb, erchemi, which means I come or go. You'll also notice on the list that it has compound forms of that word, de-erchemi, ace-erchemi, ex-erchemi, all deponent in their present tenses, but not when it comes to their aorist tenses. So erchemi and its various compounds is different from archemi here on our list. Now going down the list, we see baptizo is the next word, and then its first aorist spelling, ebaptisa, and then blepo, I see, and its aorist spelling, eblepsa. You'll notice here that with eblepsa, that the psi occurs there. It's that letter that sort of looks like the pitchfork there. But that is a combination of two letters, two consonants. The pi and the tense sign of sigma have combined. So from blepo, when you add the sigma to show that it's aorist, it combines into a new letter, the psi, so eblepsa. And the same is true with grapho, the next word down the list, I write. Agrapsa is that first aorist form. Continuing on with our vocabulary list, we see here at the top the present tense word decomi, which means I receive, and that is a deponent verb as well. You'll notice the amai ending is normally a present, middle, and passive ending, but it's functioning here as active. And so when it comes to the first aorist spelling, at examen, you'll notice the amane ending is also a middle voice ending. So there too, in form or spelling, it's middle, but in function, it's active. So when you translate it or interpret it, treat it as though it's an active voice verb, even though it has middle voice spelling. I know that's confusing, but that's just something you have to note, that some verbs are irregular in that sense. And the only way to really know that is to know your vocabulary, study your vocabulary words, and look them up in a lexicon or Greek dictionary. Next on the list is didasko, meaning I teach, and then edidaxa is the first aorist form. Doxadzo, I glorify. Edoxasa means I glorified. By the way, didasko, I teach. Edidaxa would mean I taught. Next on the list is thelo, meaning I will or wish in the present tense, active voice. And then when it comes to first aorist active, it changes to athelesa. Athelesa, if you want to accent it correctly, athelesa. And it means I willed or wished. Next on the list is therapeuo, I heal. And its first aorist active spelling or form is atherapusa, meaning I healed, past tense. Keruso is the next word, I preach, and then in its first aorist active spelling, it's ekeruxa, meaning I preached. And our last vocabulary words are patho, meaning I persuade. By the way, this is often sometimes used as a synonym for believing. Were you persuaded? When you are persuaded, you are convinced of something and thus you believe it. So for example, in John 3 verse 36, the negative form is used there of disbelieved. And the idea seems to be to reject something. And so sometimes, like in 1 Peter chapter 2, patho is translated there twice as believe in some translations, like the King James and New King James versions. It's interesting to note. But patho means I persuade, and in its first aorist form, it means it's pronounced epesa, and it means I persuaded. Again, looking at it from a past tense standpoint. The next word is pempo, meaning I send, and in its first aorist active form, it's pronounced epemsa, epemsa. I sent. The next word down is pistuo, meaning I believe, and then in its first aorist form, I believed, epistusa. The next word is sodzo, I save, and then first aorist form is esosa, I saved, in the past tense. The next word is pharaoh, I bear or bring, and I put two spellings there for you, even though you're only given one in chapter 15 of your textbook. The two spellings again reflect first aorist and second aorist. The first aorist spelling is enegka, and the alpha ending there tells you that it's first aorist, and then enegkan is the second aorist spelling, which we'll get to in a future study, but I thought you should know that there are two forms of that particular word when it comes to the first aorist. And sometimes there's some really difficult morphology changes that occur from the present tense to the aorist, which you see here. Let's face it, eneka or enekan looks nothing like pharaoh, but it is what it is, and you just got to be aware of that and note that. Now, going back to this subject of aspect, this is absolutely crucial for you as students of Greek and exegesis to understand this critical distinction when we come to now the significance and usage of the aorist tense. From this point on in this lesson now, we're going to be We're going to be moving on from the morphology and how aorist tense verbs are formed and spelled, and even the vocabulary, to now we're going to get to really the meat and potatoes here of this lesson, the portion that has the highest significance for you, and that is, well, how do we interpret these aorist tense verbs when we see them? And we're going to look at some of the do's and don'ts of proper and improper interpretation. But it starts with this, looking at verbs in 3D. If you recall from previous lessons in first semester Greek, I introduced this concept to you, and I'm just going to keep repeating it over and over again until this is drilled firmly into your thinking. That you need to think of verbs as having three main elements to them in Greek, starting with aspect. Aspect is the writer's or speaker's perspective of the action. It's not the kind of action or the time of action. It's the perspective of the writer or speaker. And that perspective is his vantage point. It's kind of like a camera, again, that a photographer uses. He can change the lenses and thus change aperture or perspective on a given action and capture that in the picture that he takes. Well, the same is true with a biblical writer or speaker in Scripture. They can change tenses because they want to change the aspect or perspective on the action that's occurring. And with aspect, there are essentially two aspects that you should know at this point. Imperfective, which we saw for the present tense, and imperfect tense. When it comes to aorist tenses now, we're shifting to perfective aspect, I should say. And perfective aspect is that which is more remote, in contrast to the more proximate perspective of the present tense and imperfect tense forms. There's also kind of action, which we call Actionsart, from the German word, meaning the sort of the action. And you can see that's actually a compound word in German that means essentially the same thing in English, the sort of action or the kind of action. And there can be different kinds of action. For example, when Scripture says, I believe, does that mean we should believe once or we believe continuously? Some actions are momentary, some are repetitive or continual, and that's what we're dealing with Actionsart. That's different from aspect, and we have to distinguish that. Then there's also time of action, of course, past, present, or future. When did that action occur? The only thing that's inherent to Greek verbs and their tense form every single time that tense form occurs is aspect. Actionsart and time are variable, and you must distinguish that going forward here. So get this down firmly in your thinking. I want you to think when you do your lessons and you do the exercises and the translations, even though the workbook may not ask you for the aspect of this particular verb, because frankly the textbook and workbook are outdated, I want you to think in terms of aspect first and then Actionsart and time. So you should be, every time you come across and see a verb, ask yourself, what is its aspect, what is its Actionsart, what is its time? And you should do this just almost by second nature now going forward. To help you recall what aspect is, again, this is the perspective of the writer or speaker. Picture basically two vantage points for viewing an action. Let's take one event, let's say a parade. One vantage point can be that in which you are on the curb watching the parade close up. The events are unfolding in progress right in front of you, and you could call that the internal perspective. You're right up close to the action. You are proximate as opposed to remote. And this is what we call imperfective aspect. The present tense and the imperfect tense forms have what's called imperfective aspect. Now, as you zoom out, let's say you're up in a helicopter, you're above the parade or you're at the tallest point of a building looking down on the parade, you see the action as a whole. You can see the beginning of the parade, you can see where it ends, you can see everything in between. And it may be that you're up so high looking down at the action that it seems like the participants in the parade are not even moving. They're like ants, and everything seems to be standing still. And so you have like a snapshot view, a bird's eye view of everything going on. That's, in essence, what the aorist tense form communicates in terms of aspect. It takes a picture of the whole event in summary fashion in its entirety and views it remotely. That's what we call perfective aspect. And that's what we're dealing with when it comes to the aorist tense forms. Aorist tense forms always indicate perfective aspect. Now, I know this is somewhat foggy probably in your understanding at this point, but I think as you continue to ask yourself in your exercises, what is the aspect, what is the action start, what is the time, every time you see a verb, it's going to clear up. And maybe a comparison so far of what we've studied with the addition of the aorist will help you see the differences. Again, present tense form, when you see a verb that occurs in its present tense form, that's the traditional way that we label it, luo, lues, lue, luamen, lueta, luusi, etc. When you see that present tense form, you know that in terms of its aspect, it's always going to be imperfective, which means what practically? From the standpoint of the writer or speaker, you are close to the action. You're more proximate to the action of the verb itself. Compared to the imperfect tense form, that too is also an imperfective aspect, and it is proximate to the action, but it's a little farther away in essence. You're not quite as close to it. Maybe you're a block away from the parade as opposed to being curbside. That's the analogy that I would use. And then in comparison to the future tense form, we saw with future tense that its aspect is perfective. And future tense forms are the only ones that there's no debate among Greek grammarians about and Greek scholars when it comes to the issue of time. Everybody agrees that there's no question time is inherent to future tense form. It's always in reference to future time, and it's always temporally remote in that sense. Now, when it comes to the aorist tense form, here we're dealing with perfective aspect as well, and it's a remote vantage point. Again, think of yourself being in the helicopter above the parade. And just a few things to note now regarding the aorist tense form. Every time that you see an aorist tense form or spelling of a word, and it's a verb and it's in the aorist tense form, you can say to yourself, well, I know one thing regarding its aspect, that it's always going to be that perfective aspect, a remote vantage point from the writer or speaker. You can book it. You can count on that. Now, when it comes to action start, that is a variable. That will change depending on, again, the nature of the verb that you're looking at. Is it a verb that is more continuous by its nature, like meno, which means I abide, or remain? Or is it something that's more punctiliar, if you wish, the verb for I hit, or I die, or I was crucified, something like that. That tends to be more of a one-time event. So the nature of the verb is a factor involved, as well as the context. And there are various adjectives, adverbs, and even prepositions that occur that color the context somewhat to tell you the nature of the event taking place and whether it's, again, momentary or continuous or timeless, that sort of thing. And when it comes to the aorist tense form, we're going to see that there are actually 7 different kinds of action that the aorist tense form is capable of expressing in different contexts in the New Testament. We'll get to those 7 uses in a little bit. And thirdly, again, you want to look at time. Time is going to depend on the context entirely, whether it's past time, present, or future time. I will say this, that the aorist tense is used most often in contexts that are dealing with past time, the aorist indicative, I should say. When you have aorist and you have an indicative mood combined, that tense and that mood, and then more often than not, they occur in past tense contexts. And why is that? You might say, well, if tense forms don't necessarily indicate time, the aorist isn't necessarily past tense as an event, then why is it that it's used most frequently in context with past time? Well, that's because it conveys remoteness. So if you as a writer or speaker want to describe something in retrospect, which is behind you in terms of time, it's past, the aorist tense is very good at communicating remoteness or some element of distance. And so that's why I believe aorist is very common in being employed for past tense events. But just to show you again that the aorist tense can be used of different kinds of action for different time periods, let's look at a couple of examples. The first one being Romans 5:14, where it says, "Nevertheless, death reigned," and the word for reigning there is the term for to reign as a king, basiluo, except it occurs now in the aorist tense form. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses. And you see a prepositional phrase there, from the first man all the way up to Moses. So for a period of a few thousand years, a couple thousand years at least, a long period of time is the action of the verb for reign, basiluo. So when it comes to time, this is not something that's inherent to the verb itself, basiluo, or the aorist tense, but rather it comes from the context, the prepositional phrase that is used in conjunction with the verb here. And so it has to be past in time, because Adam to Moses, neither one were alive at the time that Paul is writing Romans. He's looking back in retrospect. When it comes to the kind of action, the action sart, death reigning is something that occurred continuously and iteratively with every individual who died day after day after day. So this was something that was ongoing. And I say this because sometimes people say that the aorist refers to a once-for-all act in past time. Well, that's not necessarily true when you've got something continuous, a train of death, in other words, from Adam to Moses. And when it comes to aspect, again, here, it's very clear in this context that Paul is writing from the vantage point of looking back into time. So it's perfective and it's remote. In the next example we see here from Revelation 20, verse 4, the aorist is used, and it's used for a continuous action, but it's in the future. So again, aorist can be used for something in the past, it can be used for something in the future, it can even be used for something in the present. But in either case, it is viewing an action from a remote vantage point, and it's perfective in terms of its aspect. It's viewing that event as a complete or whole event, collectively or in its entirety. And so in Revelation 20, verse 4, it says, "And they lived," zao, and so it's in the aorist tense form there, and the word reigned occurs, again, aorist tense form. They lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Now here, fortunately, again, we have in the context a time indicator by the phrase 1,000 years. How long did they live and reign for? The verse says 1,000 years. And so that's why we know it's yet future, because it's describing the future millennium that is yet to come. The saints haven't been resurrected yet. They haven't been rewarded, and they're not reigning yet. That's for sure. Now, when it comes to action sart, again, this is an action. Living and reigning is something that's repeated, it's continuous, it's iterative, and therefore it's not something that's punctiliar or momentary or instantaneous. This is referring to ongoing action. And the aorist tense is capable of expressing that based on context, or at least as part of a context in which iterative action is necessary. The aspect here, again, the vantage point or perspective is that of one of remoteness, and so it's viewing the action perfectively as opposed to imperfectively. Now, those previous two examples I showed you from Revelation 24 and even Romans 5:14 should indicate very clearly the flexibility of the aorist tense form, where it can be used, again, in context dealing with a past action or a present or future action, or even different types of action itself. It could be momentary, it could be continuous. But one thing is true in every case when the aorist tense is used, that it is perfective in its aspect or its vantage point. Now, I also want to just cover with you, with the time remaining in this lesson, 7 different uses of the aorist tense form. And you should at least be familiar with this list here of 7. Some Greek grammarians say there's more than 7, some say there's less than these 7, but most seem to believe that there are at least these 7 uses. And so I want you to be familiar with these to the point where if you see a verb that's aorist, you should be asking yourself now, what is the usage of that aorist tense form? Could it be constative? Could it be inceptive, culminative, nomic, epistolary, futuristic, or dramatic? Those are the examples that we're going to look at this time. And the first example is the constative use of the aorist. This usage emphasizes the action as a whole in its entirety or summary form, whether the action itself was durative or instantaneous in terms of its action start, or whether it was singular or repeated. So it doesn't matter. It's viewing the action and emphasizing the whole of the action in its entirety or summary form. And I gave you several verses there that have verbs that are aorist that are used in this constative way. And here is one verse, John 4, verse 20, where it says, our fathers worshipped. There's your aorist tense form of proskuneo. And they worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. This is the woman at the well asking Jesus this question, this Samaritan woman. And here we have the aorist active indicative third person plural form of proskuneo, I worship. And so it would be we worship, or our fathers, literally they worshipped, third person plural, they worshipped. And probably the most common and basic use of the aorist tense form is what we see here, this constative usage. Now the duration of worship is presented in summary fashion here. How do we know that? Because she references fathers. And the word fathers is a trigger word to tell us that this worship must have involved more than one person and more than one act. It must have occurred over a period of time. My forefathers is in essence what she's saying. So the aspect of the action here for worship is perfective. It is being viewed summarily as a complete whole. The action start is something that was continuous or iterative. It was not a one-time event. She did not say our fathers worshipped once. The implication is it was more than one person worshiping, and so this was a pattern. And it occurred over time in the past. And the time here is past time. So this is one example of the constative use of the aorist. Here is another example from 2 Corinthians 11, verse 24, that I think is also very clear in terms of the constative usage, because there are numbers involved in this verse, and even in 2 Corinthians 11:25, as we'll see. It says, from the Jews, Paul writes, 5 times I received. Elaban is the aorist tense form of the verb here. I received 40 stripes minus 1, 39 lashes. 5 separate occasions Paul was whipped or scourged to 1 lash short of death is the idea behind 40 minus 1 there. 40 was considered the point at which a person probably couldn't survive. So 5 times this happened to him. And so we see here that in each occasion is an action, scourging, that involved repeated action, 39 lashes, but it is being viewed collectively here in its entirety as one completed whole. Paul is again looking back over time, and he's viewing these actions remotely and perfectively in terms of aspect. And yet we know that the actions that occurred were by their nature in terms of action sart repetitive. You don't get 39 lashes unless it was a repetitive event. Plus it occurred on 5 separate occasions. And so it's important that we distinguish here again the aspect from the action sart. The next verse also is the constative use of the aorist verb, where it says Paul was 3 times I was beaten with rods. The word beaten is aorist. Once I was stoned, again the verb is aorist. 3 times I was shipwrecked, and again aorist. A night and a day I have been in the deep. So beaten 3 times, stoned 1 time, shipwrecked 3 times, and yet Paul's looking back on all those events, which were repetitive events in terms of action sart. He looks back on them from the aspect or vantage point of the helicopter up above, so to speak. And so these events are viewed as a complete whole in summary fashion, and thus we have constative type of aorist usage here. It's perfective nonetheless. In fact, all of these aorist usages, as we're going to see, are all have perfective aspect because they're aorist. And yet their action start and their time can be quite different, as we'll see. Sometimes when the aorist tense is used, the emphasis seems to be on the beginning of an action. This is the inceptive use of the aorist, and this would emphasize the beginning of a state or an action itself, like in Matthew 9, verse 27. When Jesus departed from there, 2 blind men followed him. Akalutheo is the present tense form, but here it's in the aorist active indicative third person plural form. And the idea seems to be that they began to follow him. In some translations in English may even translate it that way. It would be perfectly valid to do so. But this is the idea behind the inceptive aorist. Sometimes when the aorist occurs, the emphasis seems to be on the beginning of the action. And you can translate it accordingly if you wish. That certainly would be fitting. Next is the culminative use of the aorist. This is the opposite of the inceptive use of the aorist that we just saw. In the culminative use, think of the word culmination or culminate. That's the culminative use. The idea seems to be the emphasis is on the end of an action. This emphasizes cessation of action or state, and it's often translated with the English perfect tense, where we say, I have or I had. Those adverbs are added there to help fill out the sense in English. And so the culminative use, here's an example of this in Acts 7, verse 36. He brought them out, referring to Moses, with the Israelites in the Exodus generation. He brought them out after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. So here, the verb brought refers to what Moses did for the Israelites at the Exodus event. And brought, that verb is culminative, based on the prepositional prefix that you see there for ago. It's ex ago is its root form, but the preposition ex at the beginning is the idea of to bring out. And when you think about it, you are not out of some place until you've reached the end of a process of coming out, let's say. So the emphasis here is on the culmination of the action. You say, well, that's a lot in one verb. Well, it is, but it's supported by the spelling of that verb with the ex prefix and the context. And so I would categorize this aorist tense form as a culminative use of the aorist. So we've seen with the aorist tense form that it can be used in various ways, the constative use, the inceptive use, the culminative use, and here we have the nomic use. This one's probably the easiest to understand so far. Nomic just refers to something that is a general timeless truth, a fixed principle, whether past, present, or future, it's always true. Like in Luke 7, verse 35, wisdom is vindicated by all her children. That is something that could have been said prior to Jesus' day, in Jesus' day, and after Jesus' day. And by the way, it's interesting that in this particular verse here, the word for vindicated in its root form, edikaiote, is the root word is dikaiao, from which we get I justify, or the verb that occurs in Romans and Galatians quite frequently to refer to our first tense of justification or salvation, meaning justification. And this is a really good verse here in Luke 7:35 to show that dikaiao, or justification in God's eyes, does not mean what the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox take it to mean, and some lordship salvation proponents, namely to make somebody righteous, but rather it means to declare or pronounce somebody righteous. And in this case, let's just take the idea of pronounce or declare. Wisdom is pronounced righteous or justified by all her children. Now, her children can't make wisdom right. God's wisdom is always right. But God's wisdom can be justified or declared righteous in the lives of those who demonstrate it, namely God's children. And so this is the nomic use of the aorist tense form. Next of the 7 uses of the aorist tense form is the epistolary usage of the aorist. This usage emphasizes the time frame of the recipient or the reader. And you'll notice that all the examples I gave you are from Paul's epistles. Well, that's fitting because epistolary literature is a particular genre of writing that refers to letters or epistles, as opposed to the Gospels or Acts, which are narrative, or even Revelation, which is apocalyptic. So you're going to find examples of this in Paul's epistles, maybe Peter's or John's or James, etc. And you're going to see 2 words used quite frequently that are epistolary uses of the aorist. The verb that you're going to see is grapho, meaning I write, or pempo, meaning I send. And both of these aorist uses of those particular verbs are going to be used in the epistolary way that this example is setting forth. Here in 1 Corinthians 9:15, we have an example of this with the word grapho, except it's in the aorist, agrapsa. Paul writes, to the Corinthians, but I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things, etc. So he takes the word write, grapho, and puts it in the aorist indicative, and in so doing, this becomes the epistolary use of the aorist, where Paul, as the writer, uses the aorist tense form to describe his writing rather than the present tense form, I am sending, or even future tense form, I will send or I will write, because Paul's writing from the standpoint of the readers who, when they receive the letter, Paul will have already completed its writing, and it will already have been sent out. And so Paul's writing from the vantage point of the recipient or the reader, who by the time they get the letter, Paul will have written it, and thus it's put in the aorist indicative form. This is the epistolary use of the aorist. The 6th use of the aorist tense form is what's considered the futuristic use. This usage emphasizes events that are yet future, but it's as if they've already occurred. Here's a classic example of this in Romans 8, verse 30, a verse I trust you're already quite familiar with, where the aorist tense form is used for glorified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified. Well, wait a minute. I thought our glorification was a future event. Well, it is. No church-age saint has been glorified yet. We're all awaiting Christ's return for us at the rapture to catch us up, resurrect our bodies, and get new glorified bodies and be eternally rewarded at the judgment seat of Christ. And so all of that is involved with our glorification, and that's all strictly future. So why is the aorist tense form used here? Well, the futuristic use is based on the certainty of God's truth or promises, like we see here, that everyone who's been justified, it is certain they will be glorified. And so some future actions are stated with the aorist tense because it's as though they're already accomplished. And we can state it as such in the present. And this is a very clear example of the futuristic use of the aorist. Now, I should clarify with this example from Romans 8, verse 30, that the aorist most often is used for actions which in their context occur in past time. But here the aorist obviously shows that it can be a future time, and the aspect is still perfective. It's viewing the action as a completed whole from a remote vantage point. But again, just let me clarify something very important here regarding the aorist tense form. When the aorist tense form is used for an action in future time, the action isn't any more certain to occur than if some other tense form were used, like the present or the future tense form. In fact, that interpretation of the various tense forms could really land us in some doctrinal error. I mean, can we really say that something is more certain to occur if God puts it in the aorist form, and yet it's a future event, as opposed to stating it as he so often does with the present tense form or the future tense form? Now, if God says it in his word, regardless of the tense form in which it occurs, it's as certain to happen regardless of how he says it. And so let's not make the false assumption that just because the aorist is used here and it's cast into a future event, that somehow that makes it more certain. That's a conclusion or interpretation that we want to avoid for obvious doctrinal reasons. So why does Paul use the aorist tense form here in Romans 8:30? Well, I think the action is just being viewed, thinking of the future from a perfective aspect again. And why Paul doesn't just use a future tense form for that, I don't know. Oftentimes he likes to use variety, or sometimes by using the unexpected, he can garner more interest or make his point more clear to the writer. But it doesn't mean that the event is any more certain to happen. So let's just be clear about that with Romans 8:30. Our seventh and last use of the aorist is what's called the dramatic use. And this emphasizes an action or event that recently occurred and thus has present consequences. Here's an example from Matthew 9, verse 18, referring to Jesus. While he spoke these things to them, behold, a ruler came and worshipped him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hands on her, and she will live." This ruler had faith in the Lord Jesus and worshipped him as such. And when we exercise faith in Christ, we are worshiping him as such. Now, in some contexts, you'll see that the aorist is used to refer to an event or an action that just recently occurred, but it has present effects or consequences. That's what we see here in Matthew 9, verse 18. And one tip or clue is that you're going to find an adverb of time used in these contexts, like RT, which is used here before the word for died. RT means just, or the adverb noon, which means now. Both RT and noon are adverbs of time that sort of give a clue as to when this event is happening and for how long. And so when you translate this use of the aorist, you normally have to use the English perfect tense in order for it to make sense. So here, for example, instead of just saying she died, you could say she has died. That's oftentimes how this is translated, like it is here. And with the adverb of time, RT, it's translated she has just died. And so this is the dramatic use of the aorist, our last use of the aorist. And so I trust you can see from these examples that we've just gone through that the aorist is capable of a number of different uses, but we have to recognize that these are not 7 different aspects. There's one aspect that's consistent with all of them, and that's perfective aspect, that remote perspective. But that also doesn't mean that there's one action sart or one time. Sometimes people will say wrongly that the aorist tense means inherently once for all action in past time, and that is categorically incorrect. Sometimes it can mean that, but that's not determined by the aorist tense form. That's determined again by context and by the nature of the verb itself. So remember, aorist always has perfective aspect, but the action sart and the time can vary considerably. And that's how we end up with these 7 different uses of the aorist tense form. They're different in terms of their action sart and their time, not in terms of their perspective, which is always perfective, perspective, or aspect. That's the same in every case with the aorist. With our remaining time in this lesson, what I'd like to do is just go over 3 common errors that people often make when it comes to the aorist tense form when they're doing their exegesis. And the first error that is common is one I've already mentioned, and that is to interpret an aorist tense verb to mean once for all action, usually in past time, they say, if it's in the indicative mood. Now, we've already seen that that isn't necessarily the case, but we need to be careful on this point. And I would say even for first-year students, as first-year Greek students, to be careful in this way, that we often want to take shortcuts. And let's face it, we want to find the path of least resistance, right? So who wants to recall in your mind 7 different uses of the aorist? Well, we don't. We'd like to just cross that out and have a one-to-one correspondence so that every time we see an aorist tense verb, in our minds we think it always means this one other thing. Well, that may be quick and convenient and easy for you as a first-year Greek student, but it's going to lead to disastrous interpretations. You're going to end up inaccurately handling, unfaithfully handling the Word of God, and you will not be diligent in that regard to show yourself approved unto God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed. Now, we don't do this one-to-one correspondence when it comes to other words, do we? Even in the English language, when you hear the word bear, B-E-A-R, you don't automatically assume it means one thing all the time. In some contexts, it could mean to carry a load for somebody, to bear up a weight of some kind. Or maybe it's in reference to an animal. You saw a black bear in your backyard the other day. And dictionaries will often list various meanings for the same word spelled the same way. Well, Greek lexicons do the same thing too. So if we're going to do that when it comes to word studies, why shouldn't we do the same when it comes to the uses of the aorist tense form as well? It's the same idea. You know, another example that's very important is with prepositions. You learn this in first semester Greek, that just because you see the preposition dia doesn't mean that it's necessarily because of, or that it means through or by. It depends on the word that dia occurs with. Does that other word occur, that noun or a pronoun perhaps, does that occur in the genitive case, or does it occur in the accusative case? Whatever dia occurs with in terms of the case form of that other word is going to determine how dia should be interpreted or understood, whether it's through or by with the genitive case or because of in a causal sense with the accusative case. And so those are some things that we just need to keep in mind with the aorist tense form. Now you might say, well, why do people hold to this common error that to say that the aorist tense form means once for all action. Usually they say in past time. Well, that's because in years past, really prior to the early 1990s, there was not a lot of scholarly study done on this issue of aspect that has clarified for us this distinction between aspect, action start, and time. But since those seminal studies have been done, slowly and gradually the textbooks are changing for Greek grammar as well as the commentaries. But we still have a whole generation of pastors and scholars who aren't up to speed on this, unfortunately. And it's very common to hear statements like this, that the aorist tense here means once for all action in past time. Now, in the 1970s, early 70s, 1972 in fact, there was a man named Frank Stegall who wrote an article called The Abused Aorist. And pardon the pun, but he disabused the aorist of the misconception that it means once for all action in past time. He clarified that it could be used for present time, future time, it can be used for continuous action, not just once for all action. The same is true when it comes to the present tense. More recently, a scholar named David Mathewson has written an article called The Abused Present, playing off of the same title by Frank Stegall. But in Mathewson's article on the abused present, he shows that the present tense form doesn't always mean continuous ongoing action. It can be used for action that is punctiliar or momentary, instantaneous, etc. And it doesn't always necessarily refer to the present time in which the action is occurring. It could be past or it could be future. And so, just to clarify, this is one common misconception that we don't want to hold to. There's two more, which I'll get to in just a moment. Before I get to those two other examples, let me just add this as well, that if we misunderstand this first error here, or we hold to this error ourselves about the aorist, that it's once for all action, it leads to some serious doctrinal problems with our interpretations of various passages. Here's a classic one, Romans 12:1, when it comes to the Christian life. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And the verb, therefore, present, paristemi, is in the aorist active infinitive form. Being aorist, it's going to have that aspect of more remote perspective again. But when it comes to action, start, and time, that can vary depending on the context. So if this is once for all action, as is commonly misunderstood, we could say here wrongly that God is looking for a once for all yielding in your Christian life. And this has led some, especially in years past, to use Romans 12:1 as justification for sort of a one-shot dedication approach to sanctification in the Christian life, and to justify the idea of like coming forward at an altar call and quote-unquote dedicating your life to Christ. And have you had such a crisis event in your Christian life? Well, then they cite the aorist tense here in Romans 12:1 to supposedly support that. And that's just a misunderstanding of the aorist as well as being in doctrinal error. We know the Lord wants us to yield ourselves or present ourselves to Him day by day and moment by moment. It's not just a matter of a once for all act. In fact, right within the book of Romans, rather humorously, in Romans 13, verse 7, it says to render, therefore, to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs, etc. And the word render there is an aorist active imperative of apodidomi. And wouldn't it be nice to only have to pay our taxes once and for all in the past and no longer ever have to do that ever again? Well, that would be a misunderstanding again of the aorist tense form. What's interesting is in verse 6, it says, because of this, you also pay taxes. And the word for pay there, teleo, is in the present active indicative form. And it's literally, you are paying taxes. Because of this, you pay your taxes right now, present tense. So therefore, verse 7, pay your taxes, render to all their due. taxes to whom taxes are due. And if we were to follow the old traditional understanding of verb tenses here and their tense forms, that they indicate a different kind of action, then we would have a contradiction between the present tense in verse 6 and the aorist tense in verse 7, as though Paul is saying, in essence, you are to do two kinds of action that are different. A continuous action in verse 6 and a once-for-all action in verse 7. Well, obviously, that is contradictory and highly problematic. He's not talking about two different kinds of action here. He's talking about two different perspectives or vantage points for the very same action. And that's why understanding, again, action start, time, and aspect are all different. That distinction is very helpful. The second common error that people often commit when it comes to the aorist tense form in their exegesis is to say that the aorist tense means this or that, instead of saying it is used this way or that way. When we say it means this or that, we're implying that the aorist tense form, when you see it as aorist tense, that it has an inherent meaning to imply a certain kind of action or time of the action, when in fact meaning depends on usage in any given context, as we've seen. And because the aorist tense form is used in such a variety of ways to depict different kinds of action at different times, we have to be careful not to imply that it has an inherent meaning or significance every time it's used. So the second common error involves the aorist having an inherent quote-unquote meaning. And the third common error that we're going to see is similar, and that involves reading too much significance into the aorist tense form when it does occur. The third error is over-interpreting the significance of the aorist tense form in your exegesis. In other words, as you go through a verse or passage and you're identifying the different parts of speech, and you're noting that, okay, first he uses a present tense verb here, a little later in the sentence he uses an aorist tense, and you're trying to wring out the significance of the present tense and the aorist tense verbs, you have to be very careful not to over-interpret and look for just very profound meaning in every single detail of the grammar. That can lead to some problems. Let me clarify. The aorist tense is the most common tense of all the Greek verb tenses in terms of how often it occurs in the New Testament. The aorist tense occurs almost 6,000 times in the New Testament, 5,919 times to be precise. The second most common occurrence is the present tense form. It's used about 5,500 times, so still quite frequently, but not as much as the aorist tense. When it comes to the imperfect tense form, future, perfect, pluperfect tenses, as we'll see in our future studies, they occur far less often than the aorist and the present tense forms do. What does that tell us? It tells us that the aorist tense form is so common that it should be more apparent that the Greeks used it most often to depict just simple facts or background information, especially in narrative literature, without necessarily meaning anything super spiritually profound because of the sheer commonality of usage for the aorist tense form. In order to clarify this, I want to use an example from a narrative section of Scripture that you're quite familiar with as well. Acts chapter 16, it's the story of Paul and Silas being in jail in Philippi, how there was an earthquake. The jailer wanted to kill himself, and Paul stopped him. The jailer asked, "What must I do to be saved?" Paul says, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household." Acts 16:31. Then the jailer washes their stripes, their feet, and then he's baptized by Paul and Silas and his whole household, and they all believe in the Lord. That's the summary of this section. But I want to go through these verses with you rather quickly and just show you by way of a color code the usage of the different tense forms and why the aorist is so common and therefore not really that significant when it's used. The aorist is going to be in yellow, and you'll see that the aorist is used to summarize or narrate the main events on the main storyline. The imperfect is used to narrate events that are remote from the main storyline, often supplementary or supporting material. And it can also be used to draw attention to a main action. Because again, imperfect is more rare than the aorist, so when it does occur, it kind of pops out at you as out of the ordinary somewhat. Present tense is very common too. It's used to draw attention to significant events sometimes, to put those events in the foreground of the story, if you will, or to signal the importance of an upcoming event perhaps. And then the perfect tense, when it is used to express prominence, since the perfect tense form is very rare, not real super rare, but it's somewhat rare, more rare than the other tense forms. And so it signals prominence within the narrative or story. So as we go through these verses, Acts 16:25 through 34, notice how frequently you're going to see the yellow aorist tense verb or verbals. Verse 25, but at midnight Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Praying is present tense, singing and listening are imperfect tenses. Verse 26, suddenly there was a great earthquake so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately the doors were opened and everyone's chains were loosed. All of these verbs here are in the aorist tense form. Again, they're just giving some background information to advance the story. Verse 27, and the keeper of the prison, awakening from sleep and seeing the prison doors open, supposing the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself. And here you have a variety of verbs used, 3 different verb tenses and their forms. You have the aorist tense form in yellow again, and the bright pink or purple there. You see the perfect tense used twice, and one time the present tense used. So when the perfect tense occurs, it stands out more. We're going to see that it occurs only 3 times in this whole section that we're reading in verses 25 through 34. Here we have 2 of those 3 uses, where the door is open, and he supposed that the prisoners had fled. And when you read that, by the way, had fled, the word had should be in purple as well. But when you read that, if you're reading it in Greek, the idea of an open door and prisoners fleeing really pops out at you. That's the usage of the perfect tense here. In contrast to the more mundane facts that are set forth by the aorist tense usage in the yellow. Verse 28, but Paul called with a loud voice, saying, do yourself no harm, for we are all here. And again, you have 2 aorist uses, 2 present tense uses here. Nothing too significant or profound that should be read into the varying tense uses here. Verse 29, then he called for a light, ran in, and fell down, trembling, before Paul and Silas. 4 different uses here of the aorist, and again, all just relating some very common details to advance the story. Nothing too significant to read into them. Verse 30, and he brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? Now here you've got 3 aorist occurrences, brought, said, to be saved, and 1 present tense occurrence. So the present kind of stands out a little more from the background information of the aorist uses there. What must I do to be saved? And some have understood the present here to be used or chosen to be used by Luke the writer to convey the idea of what must I continually do? Well, the present tense is capable of expressing that, but that idea is not inherent to the present tense. And so that's actually something that's read into the present tense here. And I think it's not wise to read that, to exegete that out of the present tense here. Now, it's true that people normally assume they have to continuously do something in order to be saved. That's just human nature. That's part of our religious deception and human pride. But I don't think that's necessarily what the present tense is conveying here. Verse 31. So they said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household. Again, two aorist uses here, and saved is in the future tense. And the aorist tense here for believed does not necessarily mean, just because it's aorist tense, believe once for all, and you'll be saved. In the past, some have used verse 31 in the aorist tense to come to that conclusion. Now, that's a doctrinally correct conclusion, but you can't make that conclusion based on the mere fact that the aorist tense form is used in verse 31 for pisteuo. Verse 32, then they spoke the word of the Lord to him. They gave him some content in order to believe in Jesus Christ. They shared the gospel with them. And to all who were in his household. And again, spoke there is simply aorist tense. Verse 33, and he took them the same hour of the night and washed their stripes, and immediately he and all his family were baptized. Again, just simple statements of fact used by using the aorist tense to convey that. In verse 34, the concluding verse to this section here, now when he had brought them into his house, he set food before them, and he rejoiced, having believed in God with all his household. Brought, set, rejoiced, all aorist verbs, or a participle there, aorist tense form used anyway. And the very last form that's used is the perfect participle form, having believed, the perfect participle form of pisteuo. And what that shows, again, is when the perfect tense is used against the backdrop of all these aorist tenses, it's this statement at the end of verse 34 that kind of pops off the page at you. That's the main idea, the prominent thing that Luke wants to leave with you as a reader, because the perfect tense form is far more rare in terms of the number of occurrences it has versus the aorist tense. So if you were exegeting verses 25 through 34, and you came across all these aorist uses in the context to explain every little detail, don't become almost allegorical in your method of interpretation or allegorize and find super spiritual deep meanings behind every occurrence of the aorist. That's what some interpreters do, and it can land you in some serious trouble. Not only will it lead to some contradictions, as we've seen, when the same idea of believing is used in the aorist in verse 31, and then it's in the perfect in verse 34, and you might even find it in the present tense and other passages. It's not describing different kinds of belief, different sorts of action. It's simply different perspectives on the same action, because the writer, or reader rather, Luke here, wants to emphasize certain things as he's going along in the story. And so he uses the perfect tense here to kind of pop out against the backdrop of all these aorists. So I hope in going through this passage that has helped clarify how we should handle the aorist tense in narrative sections of Scripture anyway. Finally, let me just mention before we wrap this up that you will often hear people say erroneously that in order to be eternally saved, you must believe and continue to believe. That if you stop believing and your faith doesn't persevere to the end, that you will be eternally lost, or it'll prove that you had a false faith or a spurious faith, a non-saving faith, something to that effect. This is very common among those who believe in Lordship salvation or hold to the perseverance of the saints, a Calvinistic doctrine. I've written an entire book on that subject called Must Faith Endure for Salvation to be Sure? And in chapter 4 of the book, I cover this issue of the present tense versus the aorist tense. And oftentimes, again, people have said in the past, like John MacArthur and other prominent Bible teachers, that the present tense shows that, for example, you have to continue to believe in order to be truly saved. Well, if that were the case, then how do they explain all these other aorist tense uses of the same verb pisteuo found in salvation contexts throughout the New Testament? And I've given you several examples there on your screen. That would be a contradiction. And that's why, again, understanding the difference between aspect, action, sart, and time is critical to correct interpretation of Scripture and even handling some of these doctrinal issues in a faithful way as an exegete of Scripture. So that brings us to the end of our lesson for the aorist tense. We've covered a lot in this lesson, but next time when we cover the second aorist forms and its uses, I won't spend nearly as much time because I wanted to go over the breadth and variety of usage and some of the common errors, the how-to and how not to's of exegesis with the aorist tense form. So take all this to heart, learn it well, and you may need to review, but I believe this is critical information that will help you handle the Word of God more faithfully going into the future.